Welcome to the July Summer's Day Quilt Sew-Along. I'm excited to have you join me on this quilting adventure. Together, we'll explore the art of quilt making and create a stunning Summer's Day quilt. In this tutorial, I'll guide you through each step from block 1 to the final finishing touches, ensuring you have all the knowledge and guidance you need to bring your quilt to life. I recommend following the photograph written instructions provided alongside this video tutorial. This way, you'll have a visual reference to complement the steps I'll be demonstrating. If you find this video helpful, please like and subscribe. Alright, let's begin. Prepare your hoop and cutaway stabilizer. Load the file onto your embroidery machine and use applique scissors for trimming the batting and fabric. Start by placing batting 1 on top of the hoop and stitch it down. Once completed, remove the hoop from the machine and carefully trim the excess batting, leaving about 1 to 2 millimeters of batting around the stitching. Next, take fabric A and position it right side up on the hoop, covering batting 1. Stitch it down evenly. Remove the hoop from the machine again and trim the fabric, keeping about 1 to 2 millimeters from the stitching. Remember to leave any excess fabric in the seams. Consult the provided diagram for the applique and embroidery steps. Each number on the diagram corresponds to a specific place and line step in the embroidery file and comes with accompanying instructions. Start with the first petal, number 4 on the diagram. Stitch the place and line for this petal. Cut a piece of fabric large enough to cover the place and line and place it on top of the hoop, aligning it with the place and line. Stitch it down securely. Remove the hoop from the machine and trim the fabric around the stitching, leaving about 1 to 2 millimeters of excess fabric. Ensure that you keep the excess fabric within the seams. Now it's time to embroider the detail on the petal, followed by the satin stitch around it. Apply the same applique process to the next 2 petals, number 7 and number 11. And the flower center, number 15, are shown in the diagram. Now embroider the fly path of the butterfly. Repeat the applique process with the first petal on the second flower, number 19. And then with the next 3 petals, number 22, number 26, and number 29, according to the diagram. Now repeat the applique process with the last petal on the second flower, number 33, and the flower center, number 36. Apply the applique process to the bottom wings, number 39, and the top wings, number 42. Embroider the antenna on the butterfly. Repeat the applique process of the butterfly's body using a piece of fabric. Embroider the satin stitch around the butterfly's body. After completing the applique process, remove the work from the hoop and trim the seams to approximately half an inch. Set it aside and repeat these steps for all your blocks until they are completed. Alright, let's move on to joining the blocks and bringing everything together. It's time to lay out your blocks on a flat surface and take a moment to decide on your desired layout. Once you have a clear plan, we can start the joining process. To begin, grab the first two blocks and place them right sides together. Make sure the edges align properly and pin them together along one side. Pay attention to matching up the starting points and aligning the satin stitches with each other. Now, let's head over to the sewing machine. We're going to sew just inside the exterior stitching line created by the embroidery machine. This way, the stitching will be concealed on the right side later, giving your project a clean finish. Take your time and ensure that you maintain alignment between the satin stitches and seam to seam. Once the seam is stitched, it's time to iron it open. This will help flatten the seam and give your blocks a neat appearance. Repeat this process for the remaining blocks in the row until all of them are joined together. Now, let's focus on joining the horizontal rows. Take the first two rows and place them right sides together. Pin them along one edge, ensuring that the seams and satin stitches are aligned. Remember, the border stitching is already in place on the blocks, so we're sewing just inside that line to keep the stitches hidden on the right side later. Once again, open out the stitch seams and give them a good press with an iron to make sure they lie flat. This will give your project a polished look and make it easier to join the remaining rows. Continue joining the horizontal rows together using the same method until all of them are connected. Take a moment to check the alignment and adjust as needed. If you do find any uneven edges, don't hesitate to trim them to make them even. This step will ensure that your finished piece looks well balanced and professional. Congratulations, you've successfully joined your blocks and created a beautiful layout. Take a moment to admire your work before moving on to the next steps. Now, let's move on to adding the backing to your quilt. This step will give your project stability and a finished look, so let's get started. Begin by placing your backing fabric wrong side up on your work surface. Make sure it is smooth and wrinkle-free. Now, take the quilt you have just made with its right side facing up and carefully lay it on top of the backing fabric. Align the edges, ensuring that the wrong sides are together. Here's an optional tip. If you'd like, you can lightly spray the backing fabric to help it stay in place while attaching it to the quilt. Now, it's time to join the backing to the quilt. We'll be stitching in the ditch. This technique helps secure the layers together and creates a quilted effect. If you have a quilt of a smaller size, stitching in the ditch for the borders and down the middle should be sufficient. However, if you prefer, you can also stitch in the ditch along all internal seams for added stability and texture. Once the stitching is complete, take a moment to trim the excess backing fabric to match the exact shape of your quilt. This will give your project a clean and professional finish. Well done! You've successfully added the backing to your quilt. Take a moment to admire your work and appreciate how far you've come. Your project is really coming together. Now, let's prepare the binding for the outer edges of your quilt. You have the option to use your preferred method or follow our suggested method of making a binding. Let's dive in. To start, measure the length and width of your quilt. Add these measurements together, then multiply by 2. This will give you the length of fabric you need for the binding. If you're cutting a single piece of fabric, add an extra 12 to 16 inches to the length just to be safe. Alternatively, you can cut multiple strips and join them together using your sewing machine. Remember to add about 4 inches, 10 centimeters of extra length to each strip you join. If you're joining fabric strips, here's how to do it. Lay the ends of the fabric strips right sides together, ensuring they align properly. Pin the pieces together to hold them in place during sewing. use a ruler to draw a 45-degree angle line from one corner to the opposite corner. This diagonal seam will join the fabric strips. Sew along the drawn line, following it carefully with your sewing machine. Take your time to ensure a straight and even stitch. After sewing, trim the excess fabric about a 1/4 inch from the stitch line. This step helps reduce bulk and ensures a clean edge for your binding. Repeat this process until all the binding strips are sewn together into one long strip. Press the seams open to give your binding a smooth and flat finish. Next, fold the entire binding strip in half, aligning the wrong sides together, and give it a good ironing. This will help set the fold and make it easier to work with. Lay your binding fabric and unfold one end. Take the open end of the binding and fold it at a 45-degree angle, as shown in the diagram or instructions. Lightly press the fold to hold its shape. Open up the fold again and using a ruler or cutting mat, trim the fabric about 1/4 inch from the 45-degree angle fold. This trimming ensures that the binding will neatly overlap and create a clean finish when applied to the corners of your quilt. Now, fold the binding strip in half again, aligning the raw edges and press it down to secure the fold. Well done, you've successfully prepared the binding for your quilt. The finishing touches are just around the corner. Now it's time to add the binding to your quilt, and you have the flexibility to work from either the front or the back. If your quilt doesn't have borders like ours, we suggest starting from the back. Match the raw edges of the quilt and the binding, aligning them at the desired starting point. When looking at your quilt with the right or wrong side up, begin about halfway along one side. Using a ruler, mark a pin 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters down from the end of the binding strip. This will serve as a reference point. Now, mark another pin 3 inches, 8 centimeters down from the first pin. Additionally, if you want to create a gap for inserting the binding later, mark a 2 inch, 5 centimeter gap above the first pin. With a 3/8, 10 millimeter seam allowance, start stitching 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters from the open fold of the binding and stop when you reach the 1 inch mark. Leave a 3 inch, 8 centimeter gap in your stitching. This gap will allow us to insert the end of the binding fabric once we've completed the sewing. Then start stitching again at the 3 inch mark. Now continue sewing along the edge of the quilt, following the binding strip until you reach the first corner. When you're approximately 3/8, 10 millimeters away from the corner, stop stitching, but keep your needle down in the fabric. This will help you maintain accuracy and keep the fabric securely in place. Lift the presser foot of your sewing machine to allow for easy turning of the quilt while keeping the needle down. This step prevents the fabric from shifting or losing alignment. Now carefully turn the quilt, ensuring that the binding strip lies smoothly along the edge. Lower the presser foot back down, making sure the needle remains in the fabric. Then continue stitching to the corner. To create a neat corner, lift the binding strip and pull it against the angled stitch you just made, forming a diagonal fold. Then fold the binding strip back down, creating a fold at the top. Pin it in place and resume stitching until you reach the side of the quilt where you started, mitering the corners as you go. When you reach the pin that marks the 2-inch, 5cm distance from the starting point, stop stitching. Fold the remaining binding to sit just above the first 3-inch, 8cm mark. Trim the excess binding, leaving enough to slip into the fold. For a clean finish, trim about 1/8, 2 to 3 mm of the raw edge of the binding for about an inch, 2 to 3 centimeters. Now, insert the end of the binding fabric into the pocket created at the beginning of the binding process and pin it in place. Continue stitching the seam until the binding is completely sewn on. Fold back the binding and iron the seams flat. Next, turn the quilt over so you're working on the front side. We suggest starting at the corner of the quilt. Fold in one side of the corner just past the stitching and iron it well. Pin it in place to achieve a nicely pointed corner. Then continue folding and pinning around the remaining binding to the back or front of the quilt. Make sure to fold it just past the stitching line. Once folded, pin or clip it in place and iron it well. Now it's time to stitch anywhere on the quilt from the front or the back using the other edge stitch or stitch in the ditch method. When you reach a corner, simply leave your needle down. Lift the foot, rotate the quilt, and then put the foot back down to continue stitching. Repeat the process until you've stitched all the way around the quilt. Give your quilt a final press. Your beautiful quilt is now complete. Take a moment to admire your work and enjoy the cozy comfort it will bring. Well done.